My talk today is going to be about explaining how we can use statistics to tell some fairly familiar stories. Um, so the first thing that I'd like to point out is this really interesting story that was in the New York Times. So basically the story goes like this. Target and a whole bunch of companies collect heaps and heaps of data. Every time that you buy something, every time you pay with your credit card, people are collecting data. Every time you post something onto Facebook, Facebook are collecting your data. And the way that these companies are using this data is really becoming very sophisticated. So for instance, Target can use the data that they collect to predict who's going to buy particular products. And the purpose of that is that they can target particular people to buy and sell different products. So they were doing exactly this, and they decided to have a sale on baby items. So they did that. They sent out a whole bunch of brochures to people all over the place, and in one particular family, they got a brochure addressed to a 16-year-old girl. Now, the father intercepted this particular brochure, and he wasn't very happy. Why is Target, of all companies, trying to market baby clothes to his 16-year-old daughter? What, are they trying to encourage her to get pregnant? Anyway, he was furious. He was really furious. He went down, he told off the manager, and that was that. Anyway, he goes home and sort of asks his daughter, why are Target sending you brochures for baby products? And she goes, well, Dad, turns out I'm pregnant. So Target was able to figure out that this fellow's daughter was pregnant before he knew. And this was reported in the New York Times, and it went viral. So here's an example of where a company has been able to use data to tell a story, to make some predictions. And they can find out things that people didn't know before. Now, it turns out that lots of companies do this. Heaps of them, almost all of them, now have units of people who are able to collect data, to analyse data, and to be able to say something really useful about the products they're selling or the customers they want to serve. We have government organisations that want to know where to build hospitals. So statistics is more and more becoming a really useful discipline to tell a story, to answer questions either in business or for government or where to build a new school. Now, the internet is a wonderful way of being able to share data. So more and more we're seeing heaps of data being transmitted through the internet, and some really clever people are able to help us make sense of that data. Now, one of the people who does this really well is a Swedish fellow by the name of Hans Rosling. Anyway, he's very much interested in health, and he ended up building this platform that I'll sort of show you a little bit about, and he ended up selling it to Google. So that was some years ago. So he made plenty of money, and he's been able to share some really interesting stuff. So this is called Gapminder, and the website for Gapminder is www.gapminder.org. It's free to use. You can go there, you can have a look at the data yourself, you can have a play, because after all, mathematics is about playing, and so is statistics. So what we've got here is a scatter plot. You might have seen scatter plots at school. Now, this scatter plot has a whole bunch of information. So on our x-axis, so on the horizontal axis down here, we've got people's income. So we've got people who are fairly poor, people who are quite wealthy. So how much money people earn a year. On the vertical axis, we have life expectancy, so how long people will live on average. And the data here are for countries. So each of these little dots corresponds to a country. So China, Japan, United States, Hong Kong, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Russia, for example. Now, there's actually a lot more information on this plot than just those two variables. For instance, if you have a look at the size of each point, they correspond to the population of the country. So the big 2 points, China and India, are the two most populous countries in the world. We also have the colour of the points, which correspond to which continent that country is in. So we've got red for the Asia Pacific, yellow for the two Americas, orange for Europe, light blue for the subcontinent, green for Northern Africa, and blue for Southern Africa. Now that's a whole lot of information already, but there's also time. And the really nice thing about Gapminder is that you can actually tell the history of the world in a graph. So if I hit play, we see the points dancing around. And in the background you can see a year. So what we're seeing here is that all of the countries are some of the countries are becoming richer, some a bit more healthy. There's a lot of bouncing around. Now that's possibly due to different epidemics. Now we're seeing a lot more health in the 1930s and 40s. And as we move, we can see that a lot of countries are catching up. And shortly we'll have what it's like in 2012. So we can see just in that graph the history of the last 200 years. And we can also trace out paths for particular countries. So for instance, we might decide to choose Australia, and maybe we'll go for the two popular countries, China and India, and we might just start at 1900, because that's when we really started collecting very reliable data across the world. And we can actually trace the path. So we've got these little snail trails that kind of explain how countries have developed over the past few years. And you possibly saw a little loop in China just there. So in that case, the life expectancy went down really quickly. But more recently, you can see that both of those two populous countries have become quite healthy, and then moved across to become quite wealthy. And Australia, you can see, has just sort of had a fairly continuous development. Now, I can also choose some slightly different countries. So I'll clear that. So I could choose Japan and Germany, and again start at 1900. Now have a look at the path of these points. We're about to go through the 30s and the 40s. And what happened there? Well, those two big loops were a war. So what we could see there is that data has been able to be used to actually see what's going on. And we can use the data to back up our story, sort of what we know about the world. So our own story from our personal knowledge. And if I look at a slightly different pair of countries, last time through, Qatar, and Kuwait. Again, we can see that not much is happening early in the century, but just there, watch this, right off the screen. So what's happened there is that they've found oil and they've become really rich, and they've decided to invest that in health. So what we see is the two countries become quite rich, and then they improve their health by investing in health. So this particular tool is able to tell us a story just using two variables. And we can see all sorts of things going on. So imagine what we could do if we had even more variables. And what we can also see here is that those points seem to be in sort of a rough line. So we can use what we know in maths about straight lines to actually try and model that relationship. However, that's not entirely true. So if I have a look down here, the income is actually on what's called a log scale. So if I transform it back to the original scale, we can actually see that it's got a very strange curve. And for those of you who've done logarithms, you'd know that that could possibly be a log scale. So here's another place where really having a good idea of different mathematical functions that you'll come across as you go through school is going to be really useful. Now, there are a whole other different types of relationships. Might just make the relationship a little bit more basic. I could have a look at, for instance, the number of children per woman. So, on average, how big is a family? And again, we can see how things have changed. So in the 1800s, we can see that families were really quite big. Most women would have at least 4 children on average across the countries. But then as time goes on, we can see some of the wealthier orange and yellow countries, the birth rate's going down quite a lot. And some of the other countries are starting to follow. And we can see that those African countries in blue still have really quite a high birth rate. But as we move towards today, we can see that that's actually changed quite a bit. And those African countries are starting to have fewer children per woman. And quite possibly, this could possibly be related to child mortality. So we could actually have a look and see, is that true? No, that's not going to work. Yep. So we can see that sort of in the late 1800s, child mortality is really high. But if we play and we move through time, we can see that a lot of the wealthier countries are starting to have a reduced child mortality and are having fewer children. And that seems to be the overall trend. Well, maybe not that green country, Yemen. So even with such a simple tool, we can actually look for relationships within data and we can tell a story. And that's really what I find is very interesting about statistics. With not much information, we can tell a story. So that's one place where we can look at data. Now, it turns out there was actually a really big report sent out by the McKinsey Global Institute, and there are a variety of other people who have released similar reports as well. But what they're saying, both this report and reports in general, is that the ability to make sense of data is becoming a really, really big skill. So it's something that people actually want. It's the sort of thing that gets people jobs. And as time progresses, as we get even more data, being able to do something sensible with that data is going to just be more useful. So for instance, people are analysing Twitter feeds to see how well different political parties are going in an election. So instead of just polling, they're looking at tweets. And we can also see what trends are important and what products might be useful if you're trying to sell something. And the other thing that has really happened quite a bit is that people are starting to look outside to get data, to make sense of data. So there's this company called Kaggle. And what Kaggle do is they run competitions. And in those competitions, what people are able to do is try and make predictions. And some of the competitions really do go for a lot of money. So if you have the best model, if you're able to do the best predictions, you end up being able to win a lot of money. So if I look at the competitions here, you can see that there's a whole bunch of different competitions. One that's quite interesting here is the Facebook recruiting. It turns out that Facebook actually offer people jobs based on how well they go in these competitions. So that's how they get people on staff. But for instance, there's a competition here getting people to try and predict weather using what people tweet. So if we have a look in here, they're going to create a data library and they're going to use that to try and predict the weather. Now, for completely free, you can get their data. So you can just download their data, training and testing, and it describes a little bit about the data, and you're able to use that to have a bit of a play, see what you can find. And even tools so basic as Excel can be used to analyze data, although there's some really much better free alternatives like R that can do that. Can you create an algorithm to distinguish between dogs and cats? And there's a whole bunch of things that you might want to try and use to predict that. So for instance, a sec. Oh, can't look in. So maybe it's it's image recognition in this case. So for this particular data set, can you actually look at a picture of a dog or cat and identify the animal as a dog or cat? And people can build statistical models to do this. And there are a whole bunch of other competitions. There was one competition that actually went for $3 million to the winner. So if you feel like making a bit of money, you might have a chance here. But the thing that I really want to explain here is that statistics is incredibly useful. It can help you understand the world around you. It's a really good skill for getting a job, and it's just really interesting. So I'd like to thank you all for listening.